Trigger warning, topics may include diplomacy and communism practices. Annyeong haseyo, guligo hwangamnida, to A Drink with the Past, where we are immersing into Korea as a whole, from its origin to its split of the North and South, to how autonomous, or guided, their ideals influence the country today. This episode is brought to you by your hosts,
Martin.
and Jose. So, what are you thinking of today, since it is Sunday, for your drink of choice?
Well, for me, honestly, for my drink of choice for Sunday, Sunday is a pretty chill day, right? It's a day to relax and just get ready for your normal work week. So for me, I'm just going with Paloma. Basically, it's a mixture of tequila and squirt. What about you?
Just raw 818 tequila from the Kardashian. But that's pretty much it. So, whatever you guys decide to drink today, go ahead and pour yourself your drink and gombe as we take a drink with the past. Gombe. Before we start, we would like to thank those that have taken the liberty of listening in our episodes. We appreciate it. If you like the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and don't forget to follow the channel and click the notification bell so that you are alerted to when new content is released. So with that being said, we are, how far are you dating back?
So, first off, this conversation is really going to be just talking about North Korea only, right? So basically this is just focusing on how North Korea was developed, how it was founded, and basically how it led to how the country is run today under the current leadership of Kim Jong Un, right? So really that's just my focus for this episode, just explaining about the history behind North Korea and basically why it is the way it is today. And if it can really be considered as its own state, right? Its own autonomous state, or can it be considered as, this puppet, or like this like minion of Russia and the Chinese Communist Party,
Uh-huh. Okay.
So really, yeah.
So when did this all start? As far as Korea being formed as one whole country?
Well, first of all, we gotta look at what was going on with Korea during the 20th century, right? So, if you remember from our last episode of the March 1st movement, right? Korea was an entire country at that point. So, moving forward after the May 1st move, the March 1st. Yeah, moving after the March 1st movement. Yeah. So moving after the March 1st movement, right? We just have a bunch of these factions of Korean groups that are not just in Korea, but also that went into exile in China, right? In Manchuria and in the mainland China, right? Shanghai, Hong Kong, right? And a lot of these Korean groups were either nationalists, there were communists, there were anarchists, there were monarchists. So basically, you have all these different groups of Koreans in exile, right? And they formed their own governments in order to preserve Korea and fight for Korean independence under, from the Japanese, right?
So different forms of government were around the country of Korea as a whole. There wasn't just one singular government overruling the country as a whole.
No, so of course you have the Japanese, the governor general of Korea, who was Japanese, ruling over the country. But then within the country of Korea, there's just the small factions of the different types of political groups.
Okay.
In Korea, and of course one of the main ones was the communists and the nationalists, right? Mm-hmm. Where the nationalists was founded by future President Syngman Rhee, as is known in the West, Syngman Rhee, but in Korea, Rhee Syngman, right? Because of like the name
the name
the certain
order.
yeah the name order regarding where you are, right? So Sigmund Rhee, I'm gonna use the Western term. So Sigmund Rhee was the leader of the nationalist version, and then like the communists, it was just divided amongst different people, right? And then Manchuria was the main area, so it's that area above Korea. It's like northeastern China, right? Manchuria. That's where most of the communists were doing the fighting against the Japanese, right? So,
Right. Okay.
and they helped the Chinese too. They were helping the Chinese fight against the Japanese, and majority of the Koreans would side with the Chinese Communist Party or the CCP, like
Okay.
fighting against the Japanese, right? So that's up until 1945, right? 1945 ends. The war ends, right? Japan loses. Korea officially gains its independence on August 15th of 1945, right?
Okay.
So every Korean that were in exile in Shanghai or Hong Kong or even in the United States, like in Hawaii, they will come back to Korea, right?
Okay.
And so and of course you have the Soviets and the American issue, right? So the Soviets were already driving the Japanese from China, right? They were already in China. And when the war ends, that's when the Soviets go into the northern part of Korea. Up, and then the U.S. goes into the southern part of Korea, and then they divided the peninsula amongst them on the 36th parallel. And it
The
was
36 or the 38 parallel?
38th parallel. My apologies. It was a 38th parallel.
Would you say that's like a equal division, or would you say one side has more
No,
land mass than
actually,
the other?
no. Like if you looked at a map of North Korea, if you did look at a map of North,
We'll insert a picture.
Korea. If you look at a map of Korea as a whole, where it was divided on the 38th parallel, it was exactly half. Like that's exactly half.
So
of
even
the
today,
country.
it's considered half of.
Well, not even today, because today it's just like a squiggly. There's like a squiggly line, and basically
Okay.
it was because of like the war. But like back when it was established, it was literally just a straight line where there was like some parts of present day North Korea, like little parts of North Korea that used to have been part of South Korea, and then some parts of like little parts of South Korea that's now
So
part
vice.
of
Oh yeah, vice
North
versa.
Korea. Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, like you have that. So of course, North Korea needed a leader, right? And the
That
Russian,
went into Korea.
that basically went into Korea. They decided to pick out a man by the name of Kim Il Sung, all
Okay.
right, to rule North Korea. So Kim Il Sung was basically someone that had known battle throughout his young adult years, right? Because
Was he already drafted into the military at that point in time when he was a young adult?
no, so with his story, his family actually fled from Korea when the Japanese went
Okay.
in. And then so he lived it up in Manchuria, and as he grew into like late teens, early 20s, he ended up joining the resistance fighter, right?
Okay, I
The
remember
freedom
that.
fighters, right? But then he got drowned into communism, right? Because of course communism was spreading from the Chinese who were communists, right? So Kim Il Sung ends up deciding to go over to Russia, right? Close to Russia, and fight in a communist military and a communist militia, where eventually he would end up fighting for Russia,
Okay.
for the Soviet Union against the Japanese right there, right?
Uh huh.
So he comes back into the country, right? But the thing about Kim Il Sung was that he didn't know Korean. He kind of lost his Korean.
You said that he left when he was a kid.
Yeah, like when he was a kid, his family fled, right? So he kind of lost his Korean right there because he only knew like, at this point, he was only engaged in like with Chinese and Russian, right? So he knew Chinese and Russian and a little bit of Korean. So basically, it was said that his entire speeches were written for him in Korean, that he had everything translated for him when he would do his speeches up
Okay.
there. So that was one of the things about him. So 1948. So 1948. That's where it is officially where the two countries, the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, were created. So 1948 was where the two Koreas were formed.
So right when each had their own leader is when their form of government was officially established for both countries.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So, and there was a vote. Obviously, there was supposed to be a UN vote, right, overseeing like the
Oh,
UN,
okay. I was about to say
like the UN vote, but like people like the northern leadership, right? The communists were trying to say like, oh well, the South, they're gonna cheat, right? They're going to rig it. They're gonna rig it, and all this. So basically, unfortunately for people up north, it kind of wasn't really that simple, because for the most part, in my opinion, majority of the Koreans that lived up north were going to vote for Democratic, right, for like the South. And but then it's like, nope, the North was like, nope, 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 they're not gonna happen. You're gonna be communist. This place is gonna be communist, right? And yeah, some of the things about communism seem too good to be true at first. So it's like collectivization, which is basically the dividing of farmland amongst the peasants.
Being
Or,
so what?
or
Like,
well, not collective. So at first, north, the Koreans that were living up north, they were now given their own property, right? They basically got rid of the rich people right there, like the rich landowners, and then it's like, okay, it's now divided amongst the people. But then all of a sudden, the government decided to put the farms into this collective, this collective system of where everyone shares the same thing, right? Everyone shares the same field, and of course, whatever they grow, it goes to the government, right? Blah blah blah,
so
right?
it's not even shared amongst them. It just goes directly to the government to later get dispersed around everyone in North Korea.
You can say dispersed, but everyone has to keep their own, right? Because it really, like, the fields is like, okay,
Okay, so
this
put an
is for
example.
you.
Like, what do they usually grow in North Korea?
Rice, obviously, rice is one of them, but of course you have grain.
So, okay, rice and grain, they're in this collective field. They get, it's harvest day. They take it all to the government. And
And
then,
they only get 10%.
so the
The
people that
people-
harvest it, they keep 10% of what they harvest.
What they grew, and
then
the
the
rest
rest-
went to the government.
And then what happens after that? They just disperse it elsewhere?
They disperse it elsewhere.
Okay.
And basically, yeah. So yeah. So at first it seemed too good to be true, right? And to be honest, North Korea was actually kind of doing pretty good, So you have 1948, and then 1949. That's where the Chinese Civil War ends, and actually, a lot of the North Korean military, right? A lot of the ones that fought in the North Korean army, they were actually veterans of the Chinese Civil War, basically.
Okay.
So because of that, that's where the North ends up doing things like militarily superior, I guess you could say, versus the South, where majority of the leaders in the South Korean military at that time were used to been part of the Japanese military.
Okay.
Right. They were part of like the Japanese, like Korean military.
Okay.
And then, but like with the North, they had more expertise because of their fighting with the Chinese in the Chinese Civil War. So there
okay.
you go. So the Korean War breaks out, right? Both leaders claim jurisdiction over the entire peninsula, and of course, in 1950, that's where the war starts, right? So basically, and here's the thing. This is where I'm gonna get to now the controversy about like whether it's autonomous or a Russian puppet, right? So the thing about the beginnings of the Korean War was that Kim Il Sung had to ask Stalin for permission.
Permission.
Yep, they had to ask him for permission to launch an invasion of the South. So Kim Il Sung wanted to bring Korea as one, obviously under communism, right? But apparently he needed to have Stalin's permission to do that.
But I don't. Why would they need someone? Was Stalin even in Russia at that? In Russia, not sorry. Was Stalin in Korea still at that time that he had to go ask him?
No, so Kim Il Sung had to travel to Moscow for like this conference, or like this pact, like where like North Korea,
Because
North Korea, China goes to Russia to sign a pact with Stalin. They go to Moscow and they do like a
because
signing.
is it because he's the one that started communism and that it felt appropriate that he had to ask for their permission to launch an invasion?
Well, at this point, so Russia was the first country to put communism into place, right?
Okay.
We have the ideology belief, right, by Karl Marx, right, in Germany, right? But Russia was the first country to actually put it into play, to actually begin communism, right? So it ends up traveling mainly in poor countries, right? Like in China, right? Basically, like with the government was bad. And of course, this was when Koreans began fleeing up north into Manchuria, that's where they are also getting exposed to communism too. So because they're taught that, oh, Russia's this great place, it's this amazing country, everyone is equal, everyone is free in Russia, right? There are food, everyone's happy, right? And it's all because of like the leader of the country, which now at that point would have been Stalin at that point, right? Because Lenin dies like in the 20s, like in the late 20s, I think, and then Stalin ends up ruling the country, leading the Soviet Union to World War II, and then the Cold War.
My only confusion is why would they need Stalin's permission but I mean, I guess this is why you're talking about, could North Korea have been able to govern itself still using communism practices and just invade South Korea on their own? Or at this point just be its own,
And
but
this is where it comes into play. So
you're saying he goes to Stalin.
So after 1945, right? Technically, 1945, 46, that's where the Cold War starts. So right after World War II, that's where the Cold War begins between the Soviet Union and the United States, right? And all the things that were happening, right? The division of Europe into, as Churchill calls it, the Iron Curtain, right? With Eastern Europe falling under communist rule, and then
So then that's the point when he's already going over there to Moscow for that conference pacts.
Because the Chinese Civil War resumed after the war ended. So the Chinese Civil War resumed. The Chinese communist wins mainland China, while the nationalist flees to Taiwan. And so the thing is, but the reason why Stalin tells Kim Il Sung no, don't invade yet, is because he didn't want to spark a war with the U.S. Like, he basically didn't want the U.S. to be involved yet, basically in Korea yet, or anything. He didn't want a direct conflict with the U.S. And of course,
because U.S. still had some sort of influence in South Korea at that point in time, or with Japan, and Japan has like the influence with the U.S. or ties.
They're about to. Well, yeah, they have ties, but it also has to do with weaponry, because which country was the only one that had?
Were they also supplying weapons? Were they also supplying weapons to North Korea?
No. It wasn't that. It's just talking about the U.S. and Russia. At this point, it's just like the U.S. and Russia, like the Cold War, right? And this was the age of nuclear weapons now, right? After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? So who was the only country that had nuclear weapons?
Okay.
Well, I'm asking you, who was the only country that had nuclear weapons?
The U.S.
Basically, the U.S. The Soviets didn't have nuclear weapons of their own yet, even though they sent spies over here to America, and they did pick up.
So that's why he said
the plans,
no.
right? That's the reason why he said no, was because he didn't want to risk that, he didn't want to risk that move with like the U.S. because the U.S. had nuclear weapons, and of course it's like, okay, we're gonna drop it on the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union successfully tested their first nuclear weapon, like 49, 50, right, like around that time, that's when Stalin gives his permission, basically gives his blessing to Kim Il Sung to invade South Korea.
So that they had equal playing field. Okay.
That's how it is. So
then he goes back to North Korea.
and they start making plans, and he and his military general start making plans.
Okay.
They start making plans, and so on June 25th, that's when they invade South Korea, right? And then, of course, the war goes on, right? And eventually ends up to the winter of 1950, where the UN forces are all the way almost close to the Yalu, River, the border between China and North Korea. Let's say Yalu. Yeah, it should be the Yalu. But anyway, but anyone knows there's a river that's dividing North and South Korea, North Korea and China.
China.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Mao Zedong tells Kim Il Sung.
Oh, Mao Zedong of China.
Yeah,
Okay.
Mao Zedong of China, the leader of the Communist Party in China. He also told this to Kim Il Sung, but also to Stalin. He says, "I will only help Korea. I'll help Kim Il Sung if it's needed. If it's absolutely needed." And so basically,
They were trying to be Switzerland with.
almost like Switzerland. They try to be almost like Switzerland, but then when the UN forces gets close to the border, that's where Mao Zedong
Like, okay,
says,
maybe I might have to step in.
I have to step in and help out Kim. Have to help Kim here, and so ends up sending hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers across the river. They end up pushing the UN forces back across the 38th parallel, and so it's just a stalemate, a fighting stalemate until the armistice is officially signed in July of 1953. That pauses the conflict, right? It's basically a ceasefire.
Okay.
So there you go. And now we get to like the good part. So after the end of the fighting of
So the 50s are over, 60s are
so
gone
50s,
through.
So this is where we have those things about how North Korea was different than the South. So South Korea was obviously in devastation, right? They rarely had any money to build the country, so they had to have aid from the U.S. and other Western countries, right? And so there was that, and then the Soviet Union ended up giving aid to the North, and they rebuilt like quickly. They rebuilt quickly, and so everything in North Korea was considered as good.
Okay.
People was getting jobs, they had food, right? And it was obviously it was thanks to like Kim Il Sung and the communists and all this, right? So basically, this is where you had a lot of people, some people defecting into North Korea because
where they're switching sides, essentially.
yeah, where there's people switching sides, and basically, so after the war, Kim Il Sung shaped his country according to the nationalist ideology of Juche, or known as self-reliance. Juche is the term for self-reliance. The state assumed tight control over the economy, collectivized agriculture, like I just mentioned, and effectively asserted ownership over all private property. So basically, the ideals of communism at this point. So state-controlled media and restrictions on all travel into or out of the country help preserve the veil of secrecy around North Korea's political and economic operations and maintain its isolation from most of the international community.
Oh, okay.
And of course, basically, yeah, so and of course, thanks to investment in mining, steel production, and other heavy industries, North Korea's civilian and military economy initially outpaced its southern rival. And with Soviet backing, Kim built his military into one of the world's strongest, even as many ordinary civilians grew poorer, though.
Oh.
But then it's all going to change in the 80s, where South Korea's economy would end up booming, known as the Miracle of the Han River, and that was where the growth of the North is gonna stagnate. It's gonna
The Han
like
River
go
being
down.
closer to South Korea?
Well, no, because the Han River is the river that's in Seoul. Because
Oh.
it's the capital, right? The Miracle of the Han River, right? That's where the government
Oh,
does that.
okay.
So, in the '80s, South Korea's economy begins to boom into what it is today, while the North goes down.
So everything is
And
shifted
so
at that point in terms
everything
of like
everything got
the
shifted.
wealth.
Yeah, everything got shifted at that point, right? And so because of the dissolution of and then we go into the '90s with Kim Il Sung has been the leader ever since 1948 all the way.
Since the birth of North Korea,
Yeah,
he's been the leader.
yeah, Kim Il Sung has been the leader, right? And then it shifts to his son Kim Jong Il, right? So the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc did hurt North Korea's economy, right? So 1989, right? This was where the Berlin Wall comes down, right? And a lot of the Eastern European countries began to revolt against the communist governments within their countries, and then the Soviet Union collapses, and that leaves North Korea into becoming like a dependent state, into becoming independent, of not being dependent anymore on the Soviet Union, right? So because of that, North Korea's economy plummeted, and it left the Kim regime with China as its only remaining ally.
So then it's just North Korea and China.
At that point, it's going to be North Korea and China. In 1994, Kim Il Sung dies of a heart attack, and he would be succeeded by his son Kim
Kim
Jong
Jong
Il.
Il.
And then Kim Jong Il, though, instituted this policy of the military being first, establishing the Korean People's Army as the leading political and economic force in the nation. So basically, this is going to be like totally a military dictatorship under Kim Jong Il. Right,
This is
the
what,
military
19?
in the '90s. So this is going to be in the '90s. So basically, this completely turns North Korea into more of a militaristic country where the military is in charge of the political and the economic force,
Okay.
right? And so it widened the existing inequalities now between the military and the elite citizens and the vast majority of ordinary North Korean citizens. So now there's going to be inequalities, not equality, like
How communism is
communism.
supposed to be.
Yeah. So now there's going to be inequalities between the military, the elites, and the ordinary citizens. So it's going to be like divided into like three groups,
Okay.
basically. And then, of course, one of the worst things that could have happened in Kim Jong Il's first years as leader was widespread flooding, poor agricultural policies, and economic mismanagement, which will lead to like the most serious famine that North Korea had ever witnessed, with hundreds of thousands of people dying of starvation and many more crippled by malnutrition. And then this was where black markets would begin to come up in the country to meet shortages that would force the government to take measures to liberalize the state-run economy. And it was at this point where, since North Korea was like considered like too poor now, it was like can now it could have been viewed like as a third world country at that point. A lot of a lot of countries actually started sending aid, including the U.S. The U.S. We sent aid to North Korea during that time to help out,
Okay.
like with food. But then, of course, you go into the 2000s. North Korea was at this point trying to come closer than ever to forge peace with the U.S. All right. And they even hosted U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright in Pyongyang in 2000, right? So it was close, but relations between the two Koreas and between North Korea and the West would soon deteriorate due to North Korea's aggressive efforts to become a nuclear power.
So Madame Albright, or what is Madeleine Albright's in Pyongyang, and she hears that these two are still fighting over, or now that they're arguing over who gets to hold nuclear ownership of like, or who has who can claim nuclear power at that point.
Well, first of all, nuclear power wasn't even brought up. I think it was just trying to mend relations, like kind of make relations better between the two countries, right?
Because South Korea has ties with the U.S.
Exactly right. And yes, at this point, they did wanted to try to talk about having nuclear power, like basically have nuclear stuff, right? So even though Kim Jong Il though had pledged to abide by the nuclear non-proliferation treaty that was signed in 1995, in the early 2000s, reports began to surface of underground nuclear facilities and ongoing research into the production of highly enriched uranium. Right. And by 2003, North Korea had withdrawn from the NPT, the Non Proliferation Treaty, expelled international weapons inspectors, and resumed nuclear research at a facility in Yongbyon. And then 3 years later, in 2006, Kim's government announced it had carried out its first underground nuclear test.
So they only had that treaty there for a few years until he
They were
finally
part
had
of
his
it.
own
Yeah, they were
form
part
of
of
nuclear
it.
power, and then just decided to vacate the
The
treaty.
Yeah, so they, even though he did sign North Korea into it, eventually they just got too like greedy. I don't like they got too greedy or too like prideful, and that's why they wanted to get out of it, because it's like, oh well, we're already doing good with our nuclear facility, right? Oh, we don't need to have international inspectors telling us what we can and can't do, and all this bull crap thing. That
So they think that they're able to make their own nuclear weapons without any kind of restriction on their end.
basically, so there was that.
Okay.
Now, Kim Jong Il dies in December of 2011 of a heart attack, like his father did.
So who comes in after that?
And then the job would ends up be given to the second youngest of his seven children, the then 27-year-old Kim Jong Un.
Kim Jong Il's 7 kids was
Second.
led to his second.
Yeah,
His
youngest,
second youngest.
So that's the sixth. Yeah,
the 6th child.
yeah, to this 27-year-old Kim Jong Un, who was fashioning himself as a modern version of his grandfather Kim Jong Un, right? Because this is, yeah. So Kim Jong Un basically once believed that he is the modern version of his grandfather Kim Il Sung.
Okay.
Yeah. So he ends up taking steps to consolidate power, ordering the execution of his own uncle and political military rivals, where eventually it was him that would start executing family members for political reasons, just to get hold of power. This is like the real like power
Executing them.
grab.
Why? Like anyone that
They
didn't
were
agree
threatening.
with the ideas of Kim Jong Un at that
Who,
point?
well, those who didn't agree with him being the leader, and for those who he believed was going to try to seize power from him.
Okay. All right. So
these were
he's
like
trying to establish more power than he already has.
Yeah.
So then what happens after that?
So, of course, Kim's government continues to work on its nuclear arsenal, furthering damaging North Korea's relations with the West. And in 2013, a third nuclear test resulted in trade and travel sanctions from the UN Security Council, as well as a formal protest from North Korea's only major ally and main trading partner, China. Right? So China does not agree with that, right? Oh, the nuclear test and all that. China never agrees with it. And in 2017, the tensions ends up rising between North Korea and the United States, right? And of course, North Korea is going to launch its first intercontinental ballistic missile with the strength to reach mainland U.S. and threaten to launch missiles near Guam, which is a U.S. territory. And it tested a bomb 7 times the size of those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Okay.
So again, 2017 was the year North Korea successfully tested their first atomic bomb, basically their first nuclear bomb.
Okay.
And so basically, yeah, that's like kind of like the story behind like how North Korea became and how, yeah.
So you're saying, given the idea that he had to ask, or Kim Il Sung had to ask Stalin for permission, you feel like that was the point of contention, that they are more reliant on, the leader of communism to.
I feel like, yeah, I feel like that was where it was like, oh well, how could they be autonomous if not even Syngman Rhee asked the United States? It's like Syngman Rhee asking Truman like, hey, what do you think about this plan? Do you think we're ready to invade the North? Like, can we invade the North, please? That's like equivalent to that. So it's like,
Mhm.
how is it that like you won't be viewed as like this figurehead or like this puppet of of like the major like big shot superpower at that was there at the time, which was the Soviet Union,
Mhm.
right? How can you not be viewed as a puppet if like eventually you had to go ask him if you could invade, the other portion of the peninsula where you can't do it yourself, basically.
Mhm. Okay. I mean, do you remember that article I showed you, or like that video I showed you, like, was it a weeks ago, about, the university students hijacking that plane? Because I guess you said that was happening a few times during like the 60s and 70s, where they would hijack planes that were going to Japan, and they were trying to like take them to communist countries. Um, at that
Mm.
point, to kind of like instill the ideals of communism, even though like the passengers had no idea. Um,
Yeah, and this is where you see a lot of those things happening, right? Where like like communist believers like in Japan, Korea, like well like South Korea and other parts of Asia that wasn't communist yet, but there were communists. They actually believe that if they go to North Korea, that they will truly be happy, right? But in the case of like the 9 Japanese hijackers, right, that took that plane
mhm.
from Japan, that wanted to go to Cuba, though that wasn't the case because, of course, the fuel of the plane, and so like it's like
Mhm.
the pilot. I guess the pilots suggest like said like, oh, the only communist country you're gonna go to would be like North Korea, right?
Yeah.
So they go there all because they wanted to live in a communist paradise, right?
Mhm.
And then the same thing with South Korea too. There were some South Koreans that would hijack planes. An example of this would be when a Korean Air's plane was hijacked in 1969 and forced the pilot to go across the border, which successfully, right?
Mhm.
Successfully goes across the border,
Because they don't just let
and
anybody go into
yeah,
North Korean
and then
airspace.
yeah, and then it was tried again in 1971, which South Korea recently made this movie. It's called Hijack 1971, which tells the story about a hijacking that happened in a 22-year old the hijacker was 22-year-old and ends up he forced the pilots to fly into North Korea, right? But
To the Pyongyang airport.
well, like, yeah, to North Korea because of like he wanted to go to the north, but then the pilots and the passengers ends up fighting him. The air marshal ends up shooting the hijacker down, and when the hijacker lets go of a detonated um
Was it a pipe bomb at that point?
not a pipe bomb, but like a homemade grenade
Uh
made
huh.
out of like a
Okay.
tin can, right? The co-pilot ends up grabbing something, putting on top of it, but trying to prevent a blast from like going out, but he ends up getting
Is
injured
that where you said
himself.
last time that he lost his like arm or something like that from the
Yeah,
explosion?
yeah, he lost a lot of blood and things like that. So
Hmm.
basically, yeah.
Of course, if you guys want to get more details about that, it's under the Rotten Mango podcast for the university student hijacking the the airplane.
The
And then also there's other content that they serve as well for that. Um, but do you
yeah.
have anything
So
else?
something about that people should know, I believe, was that in the beginnings of North and South Korea, right, in 1945, both countries actually use the same flag, which is the Taeguki, which is the current flag of South Korea, right?
Say it
So
again. Taiguki?
Taeguki,
Taiguki.
yeah, the Taeguki, right? It's known as the flag of great extremes. That's the translation of it. Flag of great extremes.
Because of the
Every group,
symbols?
because of the symbols, right? Because it was actually the first flag of Korea to begin with, even before the colonial period. Like, like the Korean Empire used this flag, and every group used the flag. Nationalists, communists, anarchists. Didn't matter what group you're a part of. The Taeguki was the main flag for the Koreans, right? So
So
they
after
both use it.
they
Yes.
both use it. So but then the division happens and they do the 38th parallel. So at that point they would have to have two different flags. Or would
Mm-hmm.
they maintain the same one for both countries?
Yeah. And it is said, this is North Korean belief, even North Koreans still have to believe this to this day, that Kim Il sung was the one that designed the current North Korean flag. That it
Which
was him
looks
it was him that designed it.
you might have to
Which
show me a picture of that because I don't remember specifically what it entails.
so the top and the bottom has a blue stripe with a little thin stripe next.
So that's the current
And
one.
yeah, and then like the middle is red with a white circle with a red star towards the left, like going towards the left.
So that one is the current one of both,
North Korea.
just North Korea.
Yeah. And then of course the Taekuki is the one with the circle that looks like a yin yang, but instead of white and black, it's red and blue.
Red and blue.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, it was said that Kim Il Sung was the one that created the flag, right, etc. But it's not the case. A man by the name of Pakil, who was a Soviet Korean,
Pakil.
who was a Soviet Korean interpreter for the Soviet 25th Army, so this was basically a Soviet Korean, right? He gave a different account of the flag's creation in two interviews, right? So, according to him, the Soviets were the ones who were responsible for proposing and designing the flag. So in 1947, Soviet Major General Nikolai Georgievich Lebedev, I'm so sorry I butchered Russian names, but Nikolai, let's go with Nikolai Lebedev, summoned Kim Tu-bong, who was basically like the diplomat for North Korea, I guess, right?
You said 1947?
In 1947, so this was literally the year before the founding of
North Korea.
like North Korea, right?
So this is even before Kim Il Sung even became the proposed leader of North Korea.
He was basically the leader. He was the leader, right? So Nikolai Lebedev called
Okay.
Kim Tu-bong in to discuss whether the Taikuki should be retained by a newly founded North Korea, right? If the Taikuki should remain as the flag of North Korea, right?
And then they would ask, like, okay.
And then Kim Il-bong was in favor of keeping it, right, and attempted to explain to this Soviet general
So to explain to Nikolai.
about the flag's significance within East Asian philosophy. And of course, the Taikuki does have a lot of meaning, but then Lebedev, being a dumb Soviet like communist, new world order piece of feld, right? He ends up dismissing Kim's lecture as nonsense and superstition, right?
He thinks that Taiguki is superstitious and
Nonsense.
not necessary.
Yeah.
And he still went forward with proposing the flag that they have
And then
now.
a few months later, the Soviets sent a Russian language document outlining the design to the 7th Department of the 25th Army. And then Puck was asked to translate it to Korean, and it eventually became the flag of North Korea.
So even after telling them they wanted to just, for the sake and simplicity of everything, keep the Taiguki, Russian and Soviets say they just ignore it, and they still went forward, and they have to do it, or could North Korea at that point say no?
Well, honestly, they didn't have much of a choice because
So they weren't allowed to say no to
allies.
it.
They were
Okay.
allies, and they needed the aid. and they needed to create this new
So
world
if they
order.
hadn't had that flag, they wouldn't have any kind of assistance whatsoever with. Okay.
Yep, and then henceforth, that was where the North Korean flag came in. That is where the current North Korean flag.
So North Korea has the Taegukgi, and so it just has the North Korean flag then.
Yes.
Okay.
Before it was the Taikuki, but then
So they only have one flag, and then South Korea has their.
it basically has the actual flag, like the same flag it always had.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, that's
At least that cleared up that confusion, because I've heard back and forth of like if Korea had one flag or two flags at some point, which now you're saying it's just one singular flag.
Yeah. So to close it, basically, I mean, so could North Korea really truly be an autonomous state, like in today's term, in regards to like what's going on right now with Kim Jong Un sending North Korean soldiers to help Russia with whatever's happening in Ukraine right now, basically. So obviously it's not looking good, right? It's not looking good. So can it really be truly called an autonomous state, or it is still under like the influence of Russia and of course
Now,
China?
could you say like that? How it's growing right now in North Korea? Could you say it's a bad thing how they're building right now? I couldn't say like they're not regressing. I mean, because given what they have right now, the resources they have right now, I would assume they'd be in a state that's not how it was when the famine took place. So I can't say it's to the point where they can be on their own. But I mean, that's just with the very limited information that I could get off of. So I could say it's still dependent to an extent to the to other communist ties, in my opinion.
Yeah. So that is the question for thinking. Can North Korea truly be called an autonomous state, or basically this puppet of communist influence countries like this, like the China, like the People's Republic of China, but like to the Russian government as well?
So we'll leave that question up to you guys. If you guys have anything to share with us, let us know in the comments below. If you have any clarifications for us that we feel like we may not have addressed during this episode, feel free to also comment that as well. Thank you guys for tuning into our episode. Credit where credit is due with the Ron Mango podcast. We'll link that later, and to any of the existing information that we have set out for you guys. Make sure if you do like what you listen to, make sure to like and subscribe. Next time that you hear from us, you'll be hearing from one of us actually. When they are in.
Okay, so the next 2-3 podcasts are actually a surprise for you guys, because actually I am actually heading to Japan for
More specifically,
my spring break, and specifically I will be in Kanazawa and I will be in the Tokyo areas. So I will be reporting from Kanazawa first, in which I am going to ask the question: can Kanazawa truly be called the actual samurai town over, or should it be Kyoto? Right? So that would be the podcast that is up for the next one. All right. So I am excited to do it. I'm excited to basically bring Japan to you guys, and we'll see from there,
All right. Thank you guys for listening and for cheering with us as we take a drink with the pass. Konbei.